Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? A couple of questions came up either during class or later after class, so I thought I would just do this short video just to give you some additional context, and I'll try to cite some of my sources orally. I don't have them on the slide, and I kept this really to a bare minimum because I think you have a lot of sources to read, and so this is really directed at a few people questions and maybe just a couple of quick comments about some things that I noticed in the notes. So just some general things. I kind of merged two questions together with this. Some students were interested in a greater understanding of the timeline for Mexico's political and economic effects after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And I'm going to comment on some of the economic effects, and then you can see on the screen some of the dates that are, relate a little bit more to political. And as I'm, chatting, I will comment a little bit too on where there might be some connections to the United States at the same time period, not only the treaty, but also, and then the Mexican cession, this land that is gained, and some of the things that happen as a result of that, but also the way in which the United States develops economically, and how the slave and free states, it's so much connected to, social topics, the morality of slavery and abolitionism, and that entire thing, and the buildup toward the Civil War. But there's also some, economic aspects to the American side of things during the time period of the Civil War. When the new Mexican cession happens, so much of the conversation about slave versus free state, and just to remind you of some of the context, the United States will see Texas become a state, right essentially as Polk is becoming president. And then with 1850s compromise, the Compromise of 1850, California is brought in as a free state. Some of the additional states that would be part of the Mexican cession don't really come in as states right away. They're territories, and they're still heavily debated in terms of slave status during that time period of like the 1850s, the time period before the Civil War. And part of the reason they're not so quickly incorporated is because the populations of indigenous peoples are much, much larger. One of the things that makes that California case study with genocide against indigenous peoples is the way in which California becomes really close to be able to apply for statehood, which is based on kind of a degree of population within the society, kind of connecting to that statehood and then putting that forward to Congress. So there is a process in a sense, and it takes some time for what we would really describe today as some of the genocide against indigenous people, some of the reservations and some of the assimilation and some of those policies to take place, where statehood is actually something that you see on the map. Okay. In a like broader comment, and this is still regarding the United States, so I know there's stuff on the screen and what I'm saying doesn't necessarily connect to it, but something that I think is just some broader context about the US Civil War and the issue of slave and free states. Quite a few of you noted the Wilmot Proviso, which is in one of the readings and gets some play because it's a little bit before the Civil War. It is a way of looking at what becomes known as the Free Soil movement. This is a kind of political movement that really seeks no slavery in Western territories, and part of this is with the intent that there would be, white, maybe immigrant but white northern labor. So the Wilmot Proviso is not something that's like kind of a moral act on behalf of individuals who were enslaved. It is very much a protective type of policy in a sense for laborers who are northern industrial laborers. And the bigger takeaway is that part of what's going on with the kind of political division in the United States is very kind of wired to be North versus South at this time. And with the introduction of the Mexican cession, these new Western lands, in addition to, Oregon and other spaces, becomes kind of this invitation between North and South over the issue of slavery, but it's also to some degree an issue of which economic system is really going to dominate. And, capitalism is very much alive and well in both the North and the South. So there isn't necessarily rejection of capitalism, but there is various versions of it. The North is kind of playing out a continuation of what's called the market revolution, mills that are running on water power, a great deal of machinery. And during the demand of the US Civil War, industrialization starts to increase. We also see the same thing had been happening in Britain. So there's kind of this burgeoning industrial revolution that's happening in Europe. Some of that is going to connect to the United States, and we see like increasing industrialization. And at the same time, you have plantation slave economy, and which of these two economic systems, will dominate is kind of part of this debate about slavery versus, not slavery in the West, who will have political power, who will have economic power, and some of that is kind of based on this interaction between North and South. In Mexico, we see division that's political, and we see a lot of economic crises, but this is not necessarily a North-South thing. In fact, the North was much less populated, much less industrial, and, in some cases, some of the challenges that you may have had in finding some of the economic effects of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo outside of the Mexicans who lost their land rights and lost their property, it is hard to find really specific economic effects. A couple of things that I did find, and again, this is not necessarily in a setting that is north-south or anything like that, but Mexico, as a kind of like newly sovereign country, had also been seeing, even before the Mexican War, a great deal of, political instability, the caudillos and all of that, Santa Anna. Political instability always brings about challenges in economic growth. The data are very clear. We see a decline in like per capita GDP. It goes down from like $79 in the early 1830s down to something like $45 around 1860. So there's definitely a declining economic picture. There's a little bit of a debate over how much of that decline in the economy is maybe connected to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I think it's wise to say that, Mexico is a unique space. Some of the economy was very underdeveloped with a lot less capital investment. Part of this could very much be because of war, because of political instability, also incredibly high costs for things as basic as transportation. We don't see railroads in Mexico until like the 1870s. So whereas, in the United States, that's like a much earlier type of kind of capital investment. We don't really see that because the costs are so much higher with the topography in Mexico. And because the transportation system is not very well developed, transportation costs are really, really high. So it is quite difficult to really move a great deal of goods easily around Mexico. Some of this, recall, there are other cities that maybe Britain had tied into more because they're port cities. And so if you think back to the time in the beginning of the year, some of this may make sense. There's also very little in the way of any type of government protection of private property. So in terms of like patent law and things like that, some of you may remember some of that commentary from Why Nations Fails. So some of the, the big takeaway is some of the economic challenges likely exist before the Mexican-American War and before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But what happens with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is a couple of really significant things. One is so much land is going to become completely taken away. Not only do we see a loss of, property for what becomes, Mexican Americans and that very unique identity, but within Mexico itself, much more challenged ways of trying to collect revenues. There was actually quite a lot of fiscal autonomy in some of the places in Mexico, despite the fact that caudillos like Santa Anna, who were conservative, were really trying to centralize things. There is, in a sense, a kind of a degree of autonomy. Some of this might be the size and topography, but there's kind of, an argument that works in both ways. One is some of the economic issues likely cause the Mexican-American War to be as easy for Americans as it is. Some of the economic problems make the military much weaker, Santa Anna much weaker, but at the same time, the treaty also creates this huge, massive reduction in revenues, and it also is going to create a great deal of uncertainty. There is just a great deal of political strife, and in that time period between 1848, the treaty, and 1855, we have a comeback by Santa Anna. Juarez, who was a leading liberal, is placed in exile. He travels to the United States. He kind of builds an entire campaign to move liberal reforms back into Mexico. When that finally happens, and a constitution and some of the laws that kind of demote the Roman Catholic Church, increase secularism, basically increase kind of private property and capitalism. Some of these liberal reforms are very, very friendly, to the market per se, and we get a lot of like liberalism and capitalism and private property and also secularism, that kind of comes in this package of 1857 reforms. A lot of that is really a response to some of the conservative lack of economic, kind of protections. Some of the liberal reforms, I think it's worthwhile noting, have some very good intentions in terms of increasing social justice. A lot of them will backfire, but when you look at like economic kind of policies related to expansion in the United States, and you look at some of the ways in which slavery and Western expansion kind of define what the Civil War is about. So much of it is about slavery, but there's a lot of like economic profit behind that, and beneficiaries and people who lose in addition to the moral arguments regarding slavery. So some of those kind of arguments that also relate to the way capitalism is playing out in the United States, there is, in a sense, some very interesting things happening in Mexico, as well as we see kind of this uptick in middle class access to private property, but also a takedown of all like communally or corporate owned land. So that's the church, that's indigenous groups, that's, all kinds of things like that. And that's certainly problematic. We see the liberals also not paying their foreign debts. Some of those debts go unpaid. So we could also recognize that in the Mexican economy at this time, debts are soaring, revenues are small. That creates a lot of crises for the government, especially a government that's trying to do some big things in terms of moving property that is not circulating to anybody new from the church and other types of corporate spaces, to new property holders. And so much of this topic, feels like in some levels it's related to the very economic aspect that's behind property and the productivity of property and who has access to that. And there's kind of an economic power in that. So maybe think about some of those things. For those of you that are just looking for the political timeline, Juarez and conservatives, so the liberals and conservatives will fight in a massive civil war, which also creates a great deal of destruction. It's kind of parallel to the American Civil War, so there's a lot of ways to look at that in a compare and contrast. And this is also going to lead to the occupation of France under Emperor Maximilian, and this